Bruno, you should be flattered that people use you as a reference. You don't, because I have also taken note of your statement that Israel should embrace the 2012 conference because it is in own interest. But you also said at the same time, the opening sentence, that disarmament should not be the focus of our attention. So if the aim of the 2012 conference is ultimately to discuss disarmament, how do you square the circle?
How do you take the sentence?
Anyway, Emily, thanks a lot. It's the last session. It's not my intention to take too much of your precious time. I was asked to talk about security asymmetries in the Middle East. The idea to place the topic on the agenda came up in the context of discussions that Emily and some other friends had regarding the 2012 conference and the ongoing efforts to start a discussion with the aim finally leading to, at one point, to negotiations on the free zone, and what seemed to us, not for the first time, rather a narrow focusing on asymmetries with respect to weapons capabilities, and more specifically to nuclear weapons capabilities only. I understand the motivation of the Egyptians to have such a focused or narrow discussion. However, we think, I at least think, that there is a need to broaden the asymmetry discussion and add additional elements to the equation. I think that security asymmetries have to be discussed also in a broader context than the current framework that is being thought, namely the 2012 platform, which to my mind is not the right platform to do it. So if that is not the platform to do it, what is the structure and what kind of agenda do we want to set or establish? Consider my following remarks as preliminary remarks because, as I said, that is something that came up in the course of our conversation recently, and we wanted also, and we will probably also write something about it. So those are preliminary remarks, and I have no answers to the question that I posed. If the 2012 is not the place to deal with regional security, arms control, and ultimately disarmament, what is it? And at the same time, what kind of agenda should that new structure have? Let me start by saying that it is not self-evident for a conference dedicated to a global treaty or regime to devote a session to a specific region, and in our case, the Middle East, especially when you look at it from the Israeli point of view, that has never considered the NPT to be the appropriate venue to discuss, let alone negotiate, arms control and regional security issues, including the free zone idea. I think that Ambassador Zakharov yesterday has outlined the Israeli approach towards the whole issue. Having said that, one cannot understand Israel's attitude towards the NPT without the regional dimension. On the one hand, the official Israel, as we have heard from Ambassador Michaeli yesterday, has supported the goals of the treaty and its efforts to stem nuclear proliferation. On the other hand, It was the recognition that under the prevailing circumstances in the Middle East, joining the treaty will not enhance its security concerns. Only a radical shift in the region, that is to say, a reality where peace relationship between Israel and its neighborhood will be established and will stand the test of time, might lead Israel to reconsider its position regarding accession to the treaty, or as we heard yesterday, interesting love from Israel Michaeli, to consider joining the free zone idea as an alternative to join the NPT. And as we all know, and Emily has already referred to it, that dealing with the Middle East region nowadays is basically dealing with the notion of the 2012 conference. The regional dimension within the context of the NPT got once again a saliency in the context of the efforts to convene the 2012 conference, which is a unique ambition never undertaken before, to try and structure a Middle East WMD, nuclear weapons and WMD zone. All other zones were nuclear weapon-free zone, and it is the first attempt to construct, of all places in the Middle East, that overly ambitious idea. The reasons for Israel's reservation, at least as far as the conference is considered, I think that the official Israel has said whatever it said. I think that the reasons for Israel to stay away from such a conference are procedural, ideological, if you want, content-wise, cultural, and political. As far as the procedural point is considered, that has to do with the number of resolutions that were taken under the umbrella of the NPT, where Israel, as we know, is not a member and therefore was not party to the deliberation, let alone to the decision resolution that were taken. And here specifically I refer to the 1995 resolution, and later the resolution that was taken in 2010. The ideological problem has to do with a much more fundamental problem, and it has to do with diametrically opposed approaches to regional security and arms control that have accompanied the regional discourse ever since we have embarked on the arms control and regional security discussion in the framework of the Madrid process, which all of you know has had two tracks, the bilateral and multilateral. Let me open a bracket, because all of us now are asking the question, how can you restart a regional process, bilateral as well as a multilateral one? And one has to remember that the Madrid process has started after a war. So I would go as far as to say that, the circumstances at that time were such that the US administration has decided in the wake of the 1991 war to undertake what at that time was a rather ambitious agenda, and that is to establish a security structure in the Middle East. That was a novel idea at the time, which President Bush Sr. and Secretary of State Jim Baker had. And in addition, also to relaunch the peace process and also to have a democratization of the region. I would, as I am a realistic, pessimistic guy, I think that in the absence of a catastrophe or a lack of historic leadership in the Middle East, we will neither see a serious bilateral taking place nor any other meaningful process, let alone without a U.S. administration which is determined to push the parties as Jim Baker had done it in an unprecedented way, and I would say has set an example as to if the U.S. is really intent on doing something, finally they take all members and they simply drag them as they did with some of the participants, including the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Shamir, and brought them to the table. Anyway, in the course of those acres, we were exposed because of the first ever official interaction with the regional parties to the fundamental differences between us and the Egyptians, who were at that time representing the Arab view. That has changed because I no longer feel that the Egyptians are the one and only who can now speak on behalf of the Arab world, which is no longer there and is also diversified and homogeneous in terms of its national security interests. But as we have, as I have seen in the course of last year, the differences are still fundamental, and I do not see under any circumstances that we will be able to overcome those differences, and therefore any discussion within the 2012 will sooner or later be deadlocked because of that problem. And as I said, we, some of us in this room, were also privy to the Track 2 meetings that we had in the course of last year and a year before, as a reminder to those differences, which, if I may, in a very succinct way, sum them up. On the one hand, the one approach which looks at arms control and regional security as a long process of transformation, at the heart of is a process of building confidence, gradually building confidence, which over time would allow then in a very gradual way to move from the easier to more difficult arms control negotiation, and might in the very distant future lead also to a free zone, the nature of which remains to be seen. That is basically what is behind the Israeli attitude towards arms control and regional security, very much taken from the European experience of arms control and regional security. The other position is I would call it the Egyptian one, which considers Israel joining the NPT as the first confidence-building measure and as a step which will create that trust. And they also believe that there should be a precedent priority to dealing first and foremost, everything else is less important, with weapon systems, i.e. nuclear capabilities. Those are the ideological. As to the so-called cultural differences nowadays, which make such a conference success very much questionable, I termed the differences cultural because they have to do with the culture of cheating and deceit that is pervasive in the region of the Middle East more than in any other region on earth, starting with Iraq, going through Libya, Egypt, Syria, and Iran. And I'm sure that the last word is not spoken. I think that it is worth, not only in the context of arms control, to pose a serious question: what is it in the political culture in our region which lead countries to sign on agreements and finally violate them knowingly, deliberately, not by accident? That is something which is perhaps embedded in the culture, which should leave us Israelis and all others puzzling as to what extent, when we will take some other ambitious, will sign an agreement, whether they will always look for ways to circumvent them. Suffice it to say that this culture of deceit and cheating is also jeopardizing the future of the NPT, and that is much more important than the question whether a 2012 conference will take place or no. Rebecca, I do not ascribe to the feeling that you have shared with us as far as the NAM are concerned, that the 2012 conference will determine the 2015 conference. Yes, okay, I'm saying, but you've heard it, I'm sure, because some of them are already cautioning us that if there won't be a 2012 down the road, then the future of the 2015 conference is much up in the air. I don't buy it, because at this stage they can do it. There will be some other determinants which will determine whether the 2015 will end up as a success or as a failure. And one cannot always determine a success or failure by the fact that that the Middle East will be again something to trade off for other things that the 2010 conference was willing to. And that has to do pretty much with the way the United States will deal with the 2015 conference, and whether we will see a recurrence of the circumstances that have unfortunately led the U.S. administration not to stand by its commitments to us shortly prior to the 2010 conference. But as I said, that's the cultural point. And last but not least on the list of those reservations have to do with the Arab awakening. Bruno has seen, and he's not the only one, in Arab awakening an opportunity. Might be, but not in the direction of the 2012. There are some other opportunities which Israel is well advised to perhaps explore, not only to see the risks that are entailed with the Arab awakening, but 2 years or more after the beginning of the Arab awakening, there is no doubt in my mind and in the experts that we are dealing with a paradigm change in the region. That transformation that the region is undergoing has and will have impact on all walks of life, including the security and stability in the region. Let me point out briefly to the difference, the changes that we are witnessing as we speak in the region. It's the weakening of central governments and at the same time expanding areas which are not 100% under control of a central government. You see a domestic fragmentation, not to speak also of some disintegration tendencies that are manifested, among others, also by a priority or perhaps ascendancy of, once again, of tribal and religious rift, i.e. the Shia and Sunni. And at the same time, while the weakening, while the central government is weakening, we are also witnessing, perhaps that has already been part of the neighborhood before the awakening, but even more so afterwards, of non-state actors. Opening brackets, speaking about those new players, how do you engage non-state actors in legally binding treaties, let alone how do you discuss or negotiate with them, remains a big question mark, bracket closed. In addition, what we see is the rise of political Islam, part of which has a radical agenda, a super state radical agenda. About the place of Israel, in that agenda there is no need to spend any word. And last but not least, that is the phenomenon of failed states. As a result of my description, I fully share the conclusion of my friend Eli Levite and others but he in a paper that he wrote for the Brussels EU conference back in November made the following observation, which, as I said, I fully share. What it all boils down to is a quasi-anarchical Middle East characterized by fluidity, complexity, uncertainty, and anxiety. As a result, traditional paradigms for thinking about security in the region based on states and interstate relations, e.g. deterrence and prevention, but also alliance, peace treaties, and arms control agreements, seem less relevant, though not entirely without remaining merit. He also adds, equally worrisome is the growing challenge to the legitimacy and efficacy of those few international bodies, UN Security Council and IAEA, could provide the basis for effective action addressing the multiple security crises in the region. An additional testimony to the difficulties we are facing in years ahead in trying to combat or stem proliferation, one can also find in what I feel is an interesting report, which is not more as a report, which gives us a clue or a prediction as to what the future that is no longer what it used to be holds for us until 2030. And I refer to the Intelligence Council Global Trend 2030. It's an interesting document worthwhile reading, the section that describes the current and the trends in the coming years, reinforcing the point that I made. The report says, and I quote, "Progress on security-related issues such as non-proliferation is particularly difficult because the Middle East suffers from domestic instability and cross-border conflicts, with several countries in a state of war with each other and many refusing to recognize Israel's legitimacy and conduct diplomatic relations with it. Even among those Middle East states that have normal diplomatic relations with each other, cooperation is relatively rare." 2 more minutes. "With a severe lack of region-wide integration and institutional interaction." I would say that my lesson from that is that the classical working assumptions which determine the interstate relations, honoring commitment, which laid at the basis of arms control, disarmament agreements in the past, which were so successful in the East-West context, are not relevant for our region, and therefore which leads me to the conclusion that one has to think differently about the notion of arms control and regional security in the Middle East. And I think that I was looking, as I mentioned to a few people here, at the Asian model, which seems to me much more relevant than any other model that we usually come up with, as we are pointing out, that point out to us about other nuclear weapon region zone, which nuclear weapons free zone, which I do not feel come close to the complexity. And I think that as we look at the current Asian experience, we can only say that that model serves as an example as to the fact that even without solving political problems, that should not be a condition to setting up a regional forum to discuss security issues and also implement in an informal way confidence building measures. That said, a forum in the Middle East will have to live up, or at least will have 2 fundamental tenets that will have to be at the foundation. One will be an institutional one, and another one will be a content one. And I think that the notion which has to govern such a regional gathering, it has to be inclusive and comprehensive. Inclusive in terms of its membership, and comprehensive in terms of its agenda, so that in speaking of the asymmetries, we will finally be able to deal with those asymmetries in a rather comprehensive manner, which should include any number of subjects that define security and stability nowadays. That should also be under the term which is also known, that is cooperative security, which is an essential element on the way towards devising a regional security regime. Shlomo.
Thank you. You are the new chair?
The chair moves from one to the other.